Welcome to the University Tower. Ved evakuering er nødutgangen gjennom hoveddøren bak og sidedør lengst bak i salen. Alle skal gå rolig ned og ut til samlingsplassen foran museet ved Krististatuen. In case of an emergency, evacuation exits are in the back and by the farther side door of the room. Everyone has to walk out calmly and gather in front of the museum by the Christie statue. Takk for oppmerksomheten. Thank you for your attention.
For more than 30 years, the Rafto Foundation has supported human rights defenders around the world.
Подчас и у меня, и у моих коллег опускаются руки. Впрочем, в отсутствии гласности и в полном информационном вакууме террор и насилие могли бы приобрести еще более страшные формы, еще большие масштабы.
Torolf Rafto, a professor of economics, devoted his life to those oppressed and persecuted, whose voices were not being heard.
Det å arbeide for humanitet og menneskerett er like selvfølgelig som å puste.
Since his passing in 1986, Torolf Rafto's legacy lives on through the establishment of the Rafto Foundation for Human Rights. Since 1987, the foundation has presented the Rafto Prize annually to individuals and organizations fighting for human rights and democracy.
Living in Uganda as a gay man myself, in one word it is fear, full of fear.
Frank Mugisha is risking his life for the right to be homosexual. Leyla Zana was sentenced to 15 years in prison for her peaceful struggle for the human rights of the Kurdish people. Lydia Yusupova has suffered torture due to her brave efforts to document human rights violations, defending the victims of the war in Chechnya. Buddhist patriarch Taekwondo has spent over 30 years in prison for his struggle for human rights. He remains in captivity to this day.
I am isolated, but I am not alone. I am part of the Rafto family.
At the Rafto House, over 3,000 students are educated annually. The mission is to create awareness about human rights and democracy. 30 organizations and individuals have received the Rafto Prize for Human Rights. The Rafto Foundation aims to provide long-term support and joint projects among laureates who face similar challenges.
The prize empowers, it's very empowering, gives a sense of protection.
We need this recognition, we need this empowerment, we need somebody to hold our back.
This prize is a sign that we are not alone.
We know that despite dedicating our entire lives to this work, that we might not see change. Our children might not see this change. We do it because it's the right thing to do.
Dear Rafto laureate Ruba Moisen, dear guests and speakers, they're all friends of the Rafto Foundation. Good morning and welcome to the 2019 Rafto Conference Human Rights beyond borders, defending the rights of people living as refugees. For me, as the executive director of the Rafto Foundation, it is always a great pleasure, but also a very humbling experience to welcome Rafto laureates to Bergen. Today, we are honoring Ruba Mouaisen, a Syrian Lebanese activist, economist, and community mobilizer, for her relentless work to defend the human rights from the local to the global level for people living as refugees. As a young man, Thorolf Rafto himself had to flee. He had been conscripted to German service here in Bergen, and as he refused, he had to flee first to Sweden, then to the UK. He literally walked to Sweden, and knowing Thorolf Rafto, he probably enjoyed parts of that. But the punishment at the time for refusing German service was death, so he had to flee. And in the UK, he joined the British and Norwegian forces. He did arrive a bit late for the war. So after he had arrived, the war ended, but he was still in service there for some time. And he spent one of his longer leaves to travel through Europe. And that was a war-torn Europe. And it was probably what would become quite a life-changing experience for him. It was here he made some of the contacts that would later result in a life of supporting human rights defenders in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. He traveled through a Europe where people had to flee their homes, who had seen their villages and cities destroyed by war, lives scattered, relatives, neighbors, family killed. Those scenes and those pictures are probably not all that different from what we have seen from Syria since 2011. A war which in its brutality towards the civilian population has killed more than 500,000 people and has forced more than 12 million people to flee. 1.5 million live in Lebanon, a country of 5 million inhabitants. And that's the largest concentration of refugees per capita in the world. In the early days of the development of an international protection regime for refugees, key concerns were to ensure refugees' legal protection, promote self-reliance, and enable the refugees to settle down and rebuild their lives. Fridtjof Nansen, who as a young man had his office in this very building we are sitting today, became the first High Commissioner for Refugees. He issued passports that enabled some degree of free movement. But the human suffering caused by the Second World War both led the world community to establish in 1947 the UN Human Rights Declaration, and in 1951 the Refugee Convention. At that time, there were 1 million refugees in the world. Today, there are 70 million. Conflicts like Syria and Afghanistan and the genocide against Rohingyas in Myanmar has been some of the key drivers for the last couple of years. But we can also add that poverty, inequality, climate change is also adding and causing people to go on the move. And we will most likely see that that will increase in the years to come. And in an ever-changing world, we never really know who those refugees will be in the future. It could be you or me. And that's why the Rafto Prize Committee this year sheds light on and wants to focus on that the freedom of movement for refugees are severely constrained by non-arrival measures, the right to social and economic integration is limited, and the support for the United Nations Resettlement program is at a historical low. Most refugees today live in neighboring lower-income countries like Lebanon. The UN High Commissioner for Refugees has time and again challenged the global community to do more to share the burden, but little has been done. In Europe, we see a political backlash, where the perceived increase in immigration has led to politicians fighting to be seen as tough on migration, on refugees, and even challenging the European Human Rights Convention in doing so. The Rafto Prize 2019 therefore not only sheds light on the refugee situation resulting from the war in Syria, but also this broken system of responsibility sharing. It is that broken system that leaves millions in limbo, either being in Lebanon or in Turkey, or in a boat crossing the Mediterranean, or at the US-Mexican border, or living in Europe as undocumented migrants, and even here in Bergen. Now, I will also be your moderator today. And the most observant of you in the audience will notice that I'm, despite similar beard, is not Iyad al-Baghdadi, who was supposed to be here. Unfortunately, he is sick. So I've stepped in on short notice, so bear over with me. And Iyad sends his regards. But even if I will not be able to do Iyad justice, I can assure you that we have an excellent lineup of speakers, keynote speak, panel debate, so you will have much to look forward to today. And in that panel discussion, we will also involve you, and I'll get back to more information on that in just before the break. In the break, you can also look forward to coffee, pastry, best cinnamon rolls in town. And I'm also need to say that if someone needs to leave the room before the break, please use the exits in the back, so not to disturb. And that leaves me to introduce you, Ruba, our Rafto Laureate 2019. Dr. Ruba Meisen is the founder and director of SAVA for Development and Aid. He's an outspoken defender of the rights of people living as refugees. Her relentless demands for human rights for all refugees have been heard in international fora. Through her advocacy for Syrian refugees in Lebanon, Meisen underlines the importance of treating refugees and other migrants with dignity and as people with the right to form their own lives and destinies. Dr. Meisen has contributed locally to improving the lives of people living as refugees in Lebanon in ways that protect their dignity and the right to self-determination. The Rafto Prize 2019 underscores that everyone, not only citizens of nation-states, is entitled to legal protection and basic human rights. And Ruba, we know that as you join us on stage here today, you've just left Lebanon where we've seen unprecedented demonstrations across sectarian divides with 1.5 million people, more than a fifth of the population of the country, calling on reforms, challenging the government. And I know that your heart is very much with your friends and colleagues and fellow activists there. So we do appreciate very much to have you here today, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the floor for your keynote address. And let us, make Ruba feel welcome here and give her a warm applause.
so you had to make me emotional before starting. That was the plan. Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you so much, Justin, for the introduction, and the Rafto Foundation for this prize. I feel very honored to be here. I'm very happy to be in Bergen. It's a beautiful city, and I'm very lucky to have such beautiful weather. The autumn leaves are everywhere. It's beautiful. I want to thank also the students, because I think without them, this conference wouldn't have been possible. I've seen how dedicated they are in making all of this happen. As Justin was saying, I'm half Syrian, half Lebanese, and there is a revolution/war in both of my countries. So I think we're living at very historical times. But I'm happy and honored to be able to be here and share at least some of the plight that my people are going through. Maybe I want to start with my story, the story of how I came to this work, and the story of Sawa. I was a student, just like a lot of you, when I was 22. I was studying in London and visiting my family when I heard about the first 40 Syrian families that moved to Lebanon. At the time, those were not Syrian refugee families. They were Syrian families, because the term Syrian refugee didn't even exist at the time. So I took the car, went to check what these families needed, and wrote a text message that eventually went viral on social media. And this is how Sawa started. Today, after 8 years, we stand as one of the biggest organizations working for the right of refugees, of Syrian refugees in the world. Our values are 4 values that we try to take with us wherever we go in our work. The first is integrity. We try to tell everyone working for us, with us, or benefiting from our services that we have the honor to serve, that integrity is basically doing what you say and saying what you do, is holding the values that you believe in on camera and off camera, in front of your Lebanese friends and in front of your Syrian friends and wherever you go. Our second value that drives our work is that of dignity. We ask this is basically our log frame. This is our indicator. This is the most important thing through which we measure our work. Is the work that we are doing dignifying? For our social media person, he looks at the photo he's posting and he asks himself, is this photo dignifying? This is a very important aspect of the work that we do. Our third value is ownership. We don't own the project. We think of our work like an inverted hierarchy. We are accountable to the people. We are here to serve them. And they are the ones who should own whatever services we provide them, whatever services they deem important to them, their priorities. It is their voice and their priorities that should be there on the table wherever we go. Last but not least is the right to self-determination. This has, of course, a political element to it, because it's true that it's complicated, and geopolitics, and, and Russia and Iran, and we don't know, and there's nothing we can do, and we're only citizens, and this is bigger than all of us. But actually, each one of us has a voice. And the right to self-determination, I believe, is also a basic human right for all, to be able to determine in which country you want to live, and who is ruling, and how governance is happening. Our mission is to work with the community for the community. We support individuals so that they can build communities where they live. So what we do is we basically go into the community and we look at the community as a resource. Who here is a musician? Who here is an engineer? Who here is a doctor? And they self-organize to serve their own communities themselves. Today, what do refugees want? And what are the 4 points that I want to highlight? If you ask every Syrian or every refugee, I'm sure, from every single nationality, all they want is to be home and to go home. Of course, to go home is to go home if, and that if is on a big spectrum, and I will speak about that in a moment. But believe me, no one wants to be in a neighboring country in a tent. No one wants to be in a boat, and no one wants to be in Europe. It's not the dream of every refugee. And this is very important to highlight. Today, the first thing that the Syrian people want is to end the war, to stop the violence and the bloodshed against them. What I will speak about today is 4 other things that we are working on. First is to increase and continue supporting the neighboring countries where the refugees live. The second is to highlight that return today is premature and still not possible. The third is to look at the Syrian social fabric. And although there is soft partitioning today in Syria with different powers ruling over different elements of Syria, it's very important to always think of Syria as a unified country and a united people regardless of their diversity, which we should, of course, acknowledge and encourage. The fourth thing I want to speak to, which is relevant to this audience, is the advocating for further resettlement, and I will go into each one briefly. Why should we continue to support the neighboring countries that host the refugees? People think that refugees have been in tents for over 8 years, which means they are perfectly fine there now, they have established their lives. But actually what people don't know is that the conditions of refugees are becoming harder and harder every year. The response plan, the Lebanon crisis response plan and the Turkish response plan for Syrian refugees is very much underfunded. In Lebanon, only 30% of what is meant to be spent for refugees is actually available today. Today, every Syrian refugee in Lebanon, 76% of Syrian refugees in Lebanon live under the poverty line, and 60% of them live under the extreme poverty line. 91% of Syrian families in Lebanon are living under extreme food insecurity. 60% of the children are out of school. This is a huge number. And even those who are in schools, very few of them receive certification for the school, which means that yes, they are going to school, but this is not going to eventually lead them to go to university or their certificates being actually taken into consideration. 90% of households have no or one breadwinner. And when I say household in a refugee crisis, it's not only the small family, it's the extended household. 87% of Syrian refugees in Lebanon live under debt, and 75% borrow money to just buy food. And here, let me briefly tell you of a story. When I was perhaps maybe 23, it was maybe 1 year after we started working. It was raining and it was the winter, and we were still kind of a young initiative. And we were distributing bread in the camps, and it got a bit chaotic. We didn't have at the time still the systems in need, and it was really pouring rain. So people stood, to get the bread, and there was some chaos. So, with all my good intentions, I had to put my voice up and say, guys, please, stand in line. We need some order here. I didn't mean to say it in any condescending way. I was just, in all my good intentions, trying to get people into a line. And there I had a lesson that I'll never forget. I was walking through the line, and I heard a Syrian say to his wife, can you imagine that yesterday, a few days ago, I was in my clinic in Syria as a doctor, and today a young girl is shouting at me to get bread. And even now when I say this story, I get emotional, because this is the kind of people we are trying to serve and support. These are people with histories and stories and lives. So when we say 75% of Syrians are borrowing money to buy food, it's not a number that we should take lightly. 75% of Syrians in Lebanon live without residency permits. I know Maya is going to cover the legal aspect a little bit as speaker, so I'm not going to get a lot into that. Every winter, because Lebanon has banned the existence of permanent structures, refugees have to move their tents once and twice and 3 times because the tents are flooded by water. I remember once talking to one of the women in the camps after a few years of refugeehood, and she told me, you know what I dream of every night? I just dream to get under a big hot shower. And it doomed to me that there are so many things that we take for granted, but this is how the refugees continue to live day in and day out. I won't also speak a lot about internal displacement inside Syria because the conditions are even worse, and my colleagues also will cover that briefly. Today, throughout our programs, we offer alternative education for young children as well as for adults who have been out of school for many years. We offer protection and psychosocial support, legal services for refugees. We have livelihood programs and vocational trainings, as well as policy research and advocacy. Healthcare and relief are an integral part of our work only as a buffer and support for the other work, because we believe that any services we offer need to be holistic. Our model is to work with the refugees for the refugees. So we found some loopholes in the Lebanese law so that all the refugees can actually not work, but volunteer with us so that they can provide for small compensation services for their fellow brothers and sisters in the camps. The second theme I want to speak of is return. We are hearing all over the media, whether in Lebanon or in Europe today, that return has become a viable option for Syrians, that the war is over, that everything is great, and Syria is a wonderful country. And for that, I need to tell everyone who's spreading this news, why don't you go to Syria for your next vacation then? If it's that safe and great to live there. Syria today is still under war. It's true that the shelling and the bombs in its enormous intensity has calmed down, but we are looking at what's happening in northeast and northwest of Syria. And also the shelling and bombing is not the only thing that the refugees fear. Today, anyone between age 18 and 42, as a man, you will be taken into forced military conscription. This means that you will be forced to go and fight against your fellow brothers and sisters, which Syrians not all choose. They don't all vouch for a dictatorship that they are willing to fight with their lives and bloods. There are physical protection concerns. There are extrajudicial killings. There is a lack of freedom of movement. There is kidnappings and disappearances. People are taken to prison for having voiced their opinions, or someone from their family having voiced their opinions. So the conditions are far from being, okay for people to return. Today, people can't have access to their housing, land, and property rights because of new decrees that the government of Syria is making every day. We did recently a study, and 90% of the people we've surveyed had a home, but 65% had their homes occupied and looted, and they couldn't have access to these homes. And 30% of people didn't know what their homes looked like, other than those whose homes were absolutely destroyed. Today, 50% of the total infrastructure of Syria is absolutely destroyed. And in the majority of the areas where the refugees are from, there are no schools and no hospitals. I'm sure there are a lot of mothers and fathers in this audience, and I've seen firsthand how Syrian mothers and fathers, the first thing that they want is to put their children in school, and they are not willing to compromise after 3-4 years of them trying to get their kids into school, to leave all that behind, to go back to a country where there is no schooling at all for their kids. There are continued return-related violations happening, and there are barriers to access, and people who are going back are very much under increased vulnerabilities. So it's important to highlight today that the principle of non-refoulement is a principle that we have to hold people accountable to. If the conditions are not safe, and if the refugees don't take the decision themselves, then return should not be an option until further notice, and until the international community and the refugees themselves deem that to be a viable option. The third element I want to speak about is resettlement. As Justin was saying, Lebanon took the most refugees, and usually it's the majority of developing countries that take on the most of the refugees because they are the neighboring countries. In Lebanon, 1,500,000 are there, but estimates say that it's almost 2 million with those who are unregistered and those who have been coming back after the UNHCR stopped registering people. Just compare that number in a country of 4.5 million people to the numbers I will say. For the whole of Europe in 2015, 11,175 people were resettled. In 2017, 27,450 people were resettled in the whole of Europe. For 2018, it was 26,000. And for the first 6 months of 2019, it was 13,875. Out of this resettlement number, the majority is in Germany, Sweden, and Portugal, but Norway, out of this European number, which is a very low number, has taken 9% of that number. Today, there are 30,000 Syrians in Norway. Out of this number, 3,000 a year arrived here in legal channels through resettlement. A lot of them have been already here. A lot of them came here to study, or came here for work, and a lot of them arrived here illegally. And I'm not going to give any judgment on these numbers, but I think you can think about it and tell me what you think during the break. The fourth point I want to talk about is about the social fabric of Syria. Syria has two of the longest inhabited cities in the world, constantly inhabited cities of the world, Aleppo and Damascus. In one of the programs we offer at the refugee camps, where we use music, arts, sports, and technology to provide psychosocial support for communities and children, we were asking some of the kids where they were from. Their answers were, we were from Camp 001. We are from Camp Abu Khalid. We are from Camp Ba'a al-Gharbi. Those are all names of camps. Whereas these children are from Aleppo, they're from Damascus, they're from Hama, they're from Deir ez-Zor, they're from Suwaida, cities very, very rich with history. There is a real identity problem today that Syrians are facing. Today, there are so many divisions between rural and urban, between host community and the refugees, between Syrians who have chosen to stand for their freedom and those who haven't. But one of the things that we are also trying to work on is to defend the unity of Syria. Even if we can't control whose powers are ruling over the territory, we are here to stand and say we are all Syrians. And no matter what system of governance will eventually emerge of a political solution that we hope will be near, that we will stand to be united against all odds as Syrians. I think I will stop here, but before doing so, maybe a question that a lot of people ask is, what can we do? And here I would like to say that one of the things I'm really, really jealous from all of you about, except of course this beautiful city where you're all living, is that you all enjoy real democracy, or more or less the closest to what a real democracy is. So please don't take that for granted. You are voters and you are taxpayers. You have a decision in what your politicians are doing. And you have a decision as to how many people are being resettled. You have a decision over the role that Norway is playing in peace processes. You have a decision, and you can make your governments accountable as to where your tax money is going. Is it going into the right hands? Why don't you tell your government that we want to support local organizations directly instead of only working through UN organizations, where the majority of the money goes over on overhead cost? Why don't you become involved in welcoming resettlement into your country? Canada is providing a beautiful example on how that is being really owned by society. If you are students, writers, or academics, I know this is very cliche, but this is a very strong weapon. The pen is a strong weapon, and so are your voices. Write and be engaged, even if you live in a peaceful country. Be engaged about what's happening in other countries, but of course involve the locals in your conversations. Don't write in silos without engaging these communities with you. If you see people who look like me in the street, who sound like me in the street, smile at them. Refugees come from very, very warm countries. Not only Syrian refugees, but the majority come from countries where community and family is the most important thing for them. We are not individualistic societies, we are communal societies. So please, try to welcome these people as warmly as you are welcoming me today as a laureate in Bergen. Smile at them, ask them if they need help, support them in any way that you can. I think this is really how the world is changed. Lastly, I would like to say that I know that we are all facing huge and enormous problems, and sometimes it feels overwhelming, and even standing here feels overwhelming, because even if I think of what I did to my people, and then I look at the intensity of the world's problem, I'm like, I mean, you know, do I even deserve to be here? There are so many things I still didn't do, and so many problems I still didn't, you know, solve. And I wish I can be with Black Lives Matter at the same time, and I can be in Beirut in the protest and in Chile at the same time. And, you know, we all look at the words problem and think we want to be everywhere. And I remember an SAT word I learned, ubiquitous. You know, being everywhere at the same time. And I think technology is allowing us to really be able to express solidarity with people wherever they are. But sometimes maybe we need to be pragmatic and realistic. My partner, he's more into politics, and he's more into real politics and being pragmatic. So maybe I'm trying to be inspired a little bit. So if we can do a lot of things for all the causes, maybe we can think of the world as small circles. The world is formed of small circles, and maybe you cannot reach a refugee camp in Syria or in Lebanon or in Turkey, but what you can do is call your mother every Friday and say hello to her and ask her how she is. Maybe what you can do is smile at the person you're seeing, or maybe what you can do is, if you're a boss, to be a kind boss. And, you know, if you're a student, not to bully other students. Maybe these small little acts of kindness that we do, I believe if we add them all up together, and if everyone did their share in not accepting to see injustice and standing up for other people's rights, even around them, and in doing their responsibility in their own community, I believe then the world would have been a much better place. So I think I will stop here, and thanks again for listening to me on a Saturday. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruba, for an inspiring speech and for the challenge. We will now welcome Manar Al-Shemi on stage. Manar is a Syrian musician with a bachelor in Oriental music from Syria. Manar has lived in Bergen since 2016 and has established 2 bands. Habibis band in 2017 and 1001 Natt in 2018. He plays a fretless guitar, a new type of guitar with Oriental sound. Manar.
Hello everyone. I'm going to play new kind of guitar. It's called Fretless, and it's without this kind of bars. And you will hear something from the Middle East. And I inspired now by Ruba when she said, everyone went back home. And I will play something I found actually yesterday for the first time. It's called Freedom from Homs to Bergen.
Thank you, Manar. That was perfect. Now I would like to introduce our next speaker, Ibrahim Ulabi. Ibrahim is a lawyer at Guernica 37, International Justice Chambers in the UK, and is the founder of the Syrian Legal Development Program, SLDP, an NGO that works on human rights issues in Syria since 2014. SLDP provides legal capacity building into Syrian NGOs, as well as working on human rights and business issues linked to the conflict. Through SLDP, Ibrahim has conducted human rights work in Syria, near the front lines, and advocated with policymakers and heads of states around many capitals. He has trained hundreds of Syrians, including victims, on complex legal matters relevant to torture, forced displacement, and chemical weapons. Ibrahim also consulted for the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and the International Bar Association Human Rights Institute on Syria-related matters. He's made appearances on BBC and CNN, and today he's appearing here with us. Ibrahim.
Two very difficult performances to follow. One that shook my inner soul with her words, and the other one with his tunes. And I'm expected now to deliver a 15-minute speech. But let's give it a go. Usually, when we're invited to talk about Syria, it's a sad situation. It is not a happy occasion. But the reason, or one of the reasons why I agreed to come and speak today, and agreed is not out of ego, but it was because I had just a newborn, and so to get into trouble with my wife to come here, is because this is a happy occasion. For a change, we're meeting here today on a Saturday morning with a lot of young faces, and I appreciate how difficult that is given that it was Friday night and Halloween yesterday, so there's a lot of pressure mounting to celebrate a human rights defender with a full house. And when Ruba was talking about what you can do, you've already done something today. You've attended, and you've sent a message. Human rights and defending human rights don't get caused by humanitarian disasters. The people that Ruba and her organization are working for, they did not flee because of volcanoes and earthquakes. Probably that's the only thing left in Syria to take place. But they fled because there are politicians who are committing human rights abuses. And this morning, you've all sent them a message. That at a time where human rights defenders are being defamed, they're being targeted, they're being discredited, they're being attacked, Bergen says no. Bergen says we're here to celebrate those who defend human rights. And that is a political message that you're sending today. So I thank you. Now, delivering this speech is a little slightly challenging. One, because as I said, it's a happy occasion, and therefore I don't want to depress you about Syria and try to keep the positive spirit, which is a difficult situation. But also I'm somehow supposed to sum up 8 years in about 8 minutes. I'm a lawyer, I suck at math, it's not my thing. But I try to somehow come up with very short yes and no statements about Syria. Hopefully that will all, kind of try to get the information forward. And I've chosen 11 yes and no statements. And 11 is not an arbitrary number. It does answer a lot of my security questions. Because 2011 is a date that every Syrian remembers. It is the date that some of you might think we hate, because it's the start of the Syrian conflict, or it's the start of brutality. But if you ask the majority of Syrians, they'll tell you 2011 is a date they'll treasure forever. And so I'll take you through these 11 yes and no statements quickly. So yes, there is a conflict in Syria. But no, the conflict did not start in 2011. What started in 2011 is a peaceful uprising like the one we see in Lebanon today, asking for the most basic of political and human rights. The conflict, the armed conflict, started about 2012, when the Syrian army started shooting on the protesters, on those who demanded their rights. Some of those fighters defected from the army and started shooting back, and that's when the Syrian conflict started. And I know for journalists and media, it's difficult to figure out one word to say what started from 2011, but I myself say no. The Syrian conflict did not start in 2011. What started in 2011 was a peaceful, beautiful uprising against dictatorship. And yes, civilians are killed in Syria. Hospitals are destroyed. Refugees are fleeing. But make no mistake, because no, these civilians are not a result of war. They're not killed as a result of collateral damage. They are specifically targeted. You cannot incidentally cause rape. You cannot incidentally torture 14,000 people and summary execute them in regime cells like Amnesty reported. When the UN Commission of Inquiry interviewed 504 Syrian women about rape in regime cells, that cannot be a result of war. That is a result of persecution. So make no mistake by conflating the two. And yes, everyone is talking about a political solution for Syria. But no, Syria is not a political problem. When you say the word political problem in the UK, the first thing that comes to your mind is Brexit, elections, Labour, Conservatives, Liberal Democrats. But that's not why 400,000 civilians lost their lives. They lost it because they were particularly targeted. So Syria is not a political problem in the normal sense. It's not opposition and regime and meetings in Geneva. Yes, that's part of the process. But it's a human rights problem. And yes, there is a civil war in Syria. I used to hate using this term up until 2016. But no, it's not just a civil war. It's a proxy war. It involves the US, it involves Russia, it involves Turkey, it involves Iran, it involves Saudi, it involves the UK, it involves Europe. Almost every country is in one way or other involved in Syria. And that might seem like a depressing fact, but it's also an opportunity, because where one state is present, another state could be present. And when it is difficult to achieve things on a domestic level, perhaps the international community could step up its game. Yes, absolutely you should question and be critical of mainstream media. We've seen issues in the past. I'm not going to use Trump's words of how he describes the media, but yes, we should be critical of mainstream media, but on the other hand, not believe everything with the alternative media, Russia Today, or what we read by average Joe on social media. I was told he's called Olna Norman in Norway. So whatever Olna Norman says on Syria, it's not strictly true. Even those who say, because Syria, there's a lot of propaganda and disinformation going on, that say that I've been to Syria, and therefore that somehow gives them the legitimacy to talk about everything that's happening in Syria. Question, where have they been? What have they reported? You cannot go to government-held areas and discredit crimes in opposition-held areas in the same way that you cannot visit opposition-held areas and discredit crimes that took place in regime-held areas. So I'm not sure if this is counting down or counting up, but I'm just going to keep going. Yes, Syria was a beautiful country that you may have visited, your friends, it's beautiful, it's culture, but that's not the Syria we saw. So no, beyond this culture, behind these nice buildings and walls and stone, probably a few meters below the ground, there are people being tortured. We saw Syria as a police state, as a dictatorship. And so when politicians come out and say, by probably a speech written by their intern, no offense to their intern, and say, we want to give Syrians back the life they had, we say no thanks. We don't want to get the Syria we had. We want a better Syria. It's not about water and electricity and stone and these very nice window dressings, cosmetics. Yes, it's important, it's part of our heritage, but there is far more to Syria than the stone. And there are the people. And so, no, you might see a lot of companies trying, but they're actually trying to advertise tourism now to Syria. I've seen 2 French tourism companies that take you to certain specific areas, all on your own with about 60 military vans around you to see the things that they want you to see, to say, look, Syria is safe. Yes, refugees fled Syria. But no, most of them did not flee war. They fled persecution. And while war might end by a reduction of bombings and shellings, persecution does not. Persecution is about torture, arbitrary detention, enforced disappearance, all acts that are caused by those who still remain in power in Syria. Yes, many European states want refugees to return. And yes, a lot of refugees do want to return. But no, the conditions are not there yet. Syria is not safe. Refugees are being used as a bargaining chip by different political powers involved in Syria in order for them to say, return refugees, that will trigger reconstruction funding, all the Russian companies and Iranian companies will start making their money off that. They're all being used as a political tool. Please do not fall into that trap. And yes, state sovereignty is important, but not when it comes at the cost of the state being the primary perpetrator in Syria. By no means is the state the only perpetrator. Almost all parties to the conflict committed crimes. That is not something that we can shy away from. But to equate and conflate the numbers risks us harming the narrative, not being able to talk about transitional justice, not being able to address the victims' needs when we say and hide behind all parties to the conflict committed crimes. Because the numbers are nowhere near proportionate. And yes, war crimes in Syria are very well documented. But no, there hasn't been any political power or any political will to hold these perpetrators to account. Yes, you might have heard that Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi was killed a few days ago, the leader of ISIS. And yes, ISIS was responsible for the most horrendous crimes. But the main perpetrator is still there. And in fact, they're being re-legitimized as a partner of the international community, as a partner in reconstruction, as we speak. It is absolutely fine not to know who to support in Syria. That is okay. I don't know who to support in Syria. There's too many groups, too many factions, too many ideas, too many options. But in my opinion, it is a crime not to know who to oppose. And these are very two different things. I've been working on Syria for the last 6-7 years. I've been to the front lines. I've had to conduct the most difficult interviews with victims of torture and rape. I've seen firsthand what a barrel bomb looks like when it explodes. I still suffer until now when something gets dropped in the kitchen or there's a helicopter flying. I still, to this very day, have to check when I'm in Norway whether this plane is a civilian aircraft or a military aircraft. So yes, The work on Syria has been depressing. It's difficult, it's emotional. We lost many, many friends. We lost many family members. But no, we will not give up hope. Thank you.
Thank you, Ibrahim, for reminding us what this is about. It was a strong reminder. Now I'll introduce our next speaker. Maja Janmyr is a professor of international migration law at the University of Oslo. He has lived more than a decade in the Middle East and has conducted extensive research on the situation of Syrian and Sudanese refugees and other migrants in Lebanon, as well on rights mobilization among Nubian activists in Egypt. He has also lived for some time in Bergen. Welcome back.
Thank you so much. It's lovely to be back in Bergen, and it's so fantastic to be among so distinguished speakers and artists as well, musicians here today. It's truly a pleasure. And congratulations, Ruba, on this amazing award. Today is a celebratory day, but I will take you to a situation that's not so much something to celebrate. I've been working in Lebanon pretty much the whole time since the Syrian refugees started arriving to the country. And people living as refugees in Lebanon today, they find themselves in an exceptionally precarious and dire human rights situation. Since 2015, Lebanon's official policy has been to decrease the number of refugees on its territory by, on the one hand, reducing access to Lebanese territory, and on the other, as we've heard, encouraging return from Lebanon to Syria. Today, in 2019, the situation, the marginalization, and the exploitation of Syrian refugees is actually the worst since the start of arrivals in 2011. The worst since the start of arrivals since 2011. And I'm thankful for the opportunity to come here and talk about this situation. And more precisely, I will use this opportunity to make the argument that maintaining one's legal status is key to upholding one's human rights, to securing and protecting the human rights of individuals living as refugees in Lebanon today. And this very much includes protection from being involuntarily removed from Lebanon back to Syria. Despite hosting more than 1.5 million refugees, Lebanon rejects the notion of being a country of asylum. It has long refused to ratify the key international instruments providing for the protection of the world's refugees, the 1951 Refugee Convention, and it also lacks any meaningful asylum legislation. And this approach, I would argue, has made Lebanon's refugees particularly vulnerable to vacillating political interests. And in particular, Syrian refugees are confronted with serious obstacles to maintaining and preserving their legal status in Lebanon. New border regulations enforced in 2015 have resulted in two primary ways for middle class, lower middle class, and lower class Syrians to lawfully stay in Lebanon, either registered as a refugee with UNHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, or as an economic migrant under the sponsorship system. And this has severe implications that I will get back to. So Syrians registered with UNHCR, they can in theory renew their residency in Lebanon without a local sponsor and without the prohibitively expensive fee required of Syrians who are not registered. In May 2015, however, the Lebanese government suspended UNHCR's registration of refugees. Ruba mentioned this briefly. And this drastically reduced the country's share of officially registered refugees in line with this new policy that they're having. And this suspension also meant that many Syrians have had to obtain residency through the economic migrant rather than the refugee category. In addition to difficulties in finding and securing these local sponsors, as well as the adverse effects of having these local sponsors, paying the costs associated with these residency regulations is an insurmountable struggle in itself, and one that only very few actually can afford. So what this means is that an overwhelming majority of Syrian refugees are irregularly present in the country. In fact, about 3/4 do not have valid residency permits. And this has for years brought on a growing sense of insecurity in refugee communities, where many, given their irregular status, are fearful, and rightly so, I would say, of arrest, of detention, of deportation. Restricted freedom of movement can be seen as the main consequence of the limited legal status for Syrian refugees, resulting in a lack of access to services, particularly healthcare and education. Many are afraid of crossing checkpoints, sometimes even of leaving their homes to access life necessities. A 2018 UN report found that more than half of Syrian refugees are unable to meet the survival needs of food, health, and shelter. 9 out of 10 households are in debt. And people living as refugees are also increasingly vulnerable to abuse. Families rely on informal labor methods to survive. Tens of thousands of Syrian children are working in the informal labor market rather than going to school. In recent months, Lebanese authorities launched a crackdown on refugees working without legal authorization. Enforcement on restrictions on permanent constructions in informal refugee camps have also been stepped up this year, forcing residents to tear down concrete walls higher than 1 meter. And the informal camps are repeatedly raided by security forces in order to mass detain male refugees, in most cases for lacking residency papers, but also on unsubstantiated terror-related charges. Placing such increasingly restrictive conditions on those present as refugees has long been the primary way of making them leave. For years, Syrians in Lebanon were left with 2 options. They either leave the country or stay and accept exploitation and marginalization. International law actually prohibits such constructive refoulement. In other words, this occurs when states use indirect means to coerce individuals to return to a place where they would be at real risk of serious human rights violations. But that said, and despite this arguably widespread constructive refoulement, Only rarely did Lebanon actually physically force refugees, even those without valid residency, to go home. Until now. Today, in 2019, staying in the country is for many no longer an option amid looming threat of forced return. In June of this year, the Associated Press news agency reported that, and here I will quote, "The Lebanese authorities are making their most aggressive campaign yet for Syrian refugees to return home. They have had enough of the burden of hosting the highest concentration of refugees per capita in the world." Indeed, Lebanon's political parties across the board, they agree that Syrians should return. But there is no consensus around which actors should facilitate the process, the timing of such a process, and under what conditions such a return ought to take place. A few months ago, the Lebanese authorities nevertheless issued 2 new decisions that have allowed for the forcible deportation of Syrians, without granting them the right to defense or to challenge the return decision. And these new decisions are not only a flagrant violation of Lebanon's own constitution, but also of its international obligations. The principle of non-refoulement is and should remain a cornerstone of international human rights law, and any return back to danger and persecution is a violation of this principle. And I would like to emphasize, as speakers before me have done as well, that reasons to seek asylum from conditions in Syria continue to exist. These include those coming from certain Syrian regions where security is unstable, young men who refuse military conscription, minorities at risk, political opponents, rights defenders, and people at risk of detention and torture in Syrian prisons. Only a couple of months after the new Lebanese return decision, in June of this year actually, the Washington Post published this report highlighting the arrest and possible torture of more than 2,000 people who have returned from Lebanon to Syria. A few weeks ago, new reports surfaced about forced returns. And all of these events, they take place amid xenophobic rhetoric from leading politicians calling for the speedy return of refugees and claiming that all of Syria is safe. The Lebanese president himself has in fact gone out and gone so far so as to claim that the refugee presence is an existential threat to Lebanon. Such disturbing developments are by no means limited or confined to Lebanon. In fact, they are part of a bigger trend across the globe. Voluntary return in safety and with dignity has long been a core principle of the international refugee regime. It entails that refugees should be able to make a free and informed choice about repatriation and must not be pressed into going back. Repatriation must take place in a safe and dignified manner, with refugees allowed to return at their own pace. However, it has become increasingly common practice for refugees across the globe to be involuntarily returned to insecure countries of origin in direct violation of laws and principles that the international community has developed over the past 70 years. We see how the idea that repatriation should be voluntary, safe, and dignified has been increasingly set aside. States are insisting that repatriation should take place more rapidly, even if there have not been fundamental changes in their country of origin. Over the past 2 years, there has been a growing international effort to prepare for refugee returns to Syria. Despite the Assad regime remaining in power, despite the continued military presence of its allies, and despite the widespread prevalence of human rights abuses. And I am particularly concerned that any attempts at mass returning Syrians from Lebanon to Syria will begin with those without valid residency papers, and in particularly those who have not managed to register as refugees. And this brings me to my final slide for today, which is really a call, firstly, for more effort to be placed on removing restrictions to accessing legal residency. Secondly, allowing Syrians to enter the formal labor market and access services. And finally, to safeguard the principle that returns must be voluntary and take place in safety and with dignity. I'm happy to discuss all of these suggestions with you more during the course of this conference today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maya. I think you helped us understand the context that many Syrians living as refugees in Lebanon face themselves in, and the impossible choice many are standing in front of. We'll soon have a 15-minute break, but before we go into the break, we want you to take up your cell phones, because this is now we want to become interactive and modern, so now you can go to this. You go to the link, and there you will find these questions. And you basically want you to help us decide what questions we should ask the panel at the end of the next session. The question will be up here throughout the break. You'll also find all of the questions if you follow this link. So please do that, and we will get a sense of what you want to hear from our speakers. In the break now, there will both be coffee and pastry in the back of the hallway here. You can also go down stairs. If so, take the door on the right here. And yeah, enjoy, relax, and see you back here in 15 minutes. Okay. welcome back. I hope that you have now reached the right balance of blood sugar and caffeine levels so that you are prepared for the next and last session. I also hope that you have been voting on the questions. You can continue doing that, by the way. So just, you know, you'll be able to do that throughout this session. The next person on stage is Seina Bali. Seina is the director of Space and co-founder of Space, which is the Syrian Peace Action Center, an Oslo-based non-profit organization working since 2015 to create alternative spaces to discuss Syria in Norway. Earlier, Seina Bali worked with several international NGOs in Turkey, Norway, Syria, and Switzerland, and participated in various events engaging the Syrian civil society in diaspora. She also holds a master's degree in international development and management from Lund University. And this session will be a bit more relaxed for me and for Seina. We'll sit here and have a chat. So Seina, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here. And as Ibrahim said, I think I'm overwhelmed by the very active presence and participation by students and young people. And thank you so much for inviting me.
It's our pleasure having you here. And Seina, you have experienced the war in Syria. Now you live in exile in Norway. Can you explain how life turns out differently for different people from Syria and settling in different places in Europe?
Yeah, a big question, of course. And I think starting a little bit with my own story, because I think it's quite non-representative, so it's also good to point out and also reflect a bit on my positionality, because I left Syria in 2012. I got a scholarship to study in Sweden, so I got my master's from Lund University in Sweden, and then the reason I came to Norway was because my husband lives here, and it was also very smooth coming from Sweden to Norway and through family reunion. And I think this entry point to Norway, or to, how do we call it, the new home, or our home destination, is very formative in our experience, because when I compare myself to all my friends now who arrived also in 2015 to Norway, however, as refugees, I see there's a vast drastic change in how we were received in Norway and how we also experienced Norway, because arriving here as a refugee, it means your life is put on hold at least for 18 months. And that could be, you know, maybe a little bit tolerable if you know what's waiting for you, if you have some people to support you, if you have a network. But the system in Norway is that people are often waiting in asylum centers, and these centers are also often scattered all over Norway, and specifically very often in places where there are very few people living around them. So many people I know now as friends in Oslo have been actually really, how would I say, had damaging, kind of psychologically damaging experience the first like 1.5 to 2 years. Before now, they're of course like they're moving on, they're studying, they're getting a job, they're speaking much better Norwegian than my Norwegian. But I just wanted to refer again to this like entry point, and as well what kind of privileges we have from before, because I think that we use the word refugee often to refer to like, you know, we think it's a homogeneous group, but probably it's one of the most heterogeneous groups in the world. You know, refugees have very different socioeconomic status, ethnic background, gender, education. So we also need to be very careful, because as Syrians, having lived under dictatorship for the past 50 years, it was very formative for us, like where did we grow up in Syria, which family background again we have, was it urban or rural background, because we know, you know, not the stereotype. The numbers say that yes, Syria had high education numbers or high literacy numbers, but beyond these like high numbers, there's actually a map of huge drastic inequalities in Syria. So in one area of Syria, you have illiteracy or you have like the literacy of women, for example, only as low as 20%. In other regions of Syria, it's as high as 98%. So you can imagine. Also, ethnic differences. Kurds have been denied from their civil rights for so long. We had, at 2011, almost 500,000 Syrian Kurds who were deprived of their citizenship. So they had no basic rights to education, to healthcare, etc. So I think it's just always aware to kind of try to place people on this like matrix of several variables to acknowledge that also they experience becoming refugees differently.
And how do you see Norway, other European states fulfilling their responsibility to protect the human rights of refugees?
Yeah, that's also a difficult question, I think, today, and it's very different from how it was in 2015. Unfortunately, I don't know, experiencing this personally or like following the news, I'm not an expert, of course, in like migration policies, but we unfortunately are seeing a retreat in this kind of massive solidarity, would I say, or like welcoming movements that started in 2015 in response to the spike of the number of refugees who arrived to Europe. I don't know if you saw, like a few days ago, the EU Parliament has voted against strengthening like the search and rescue operations in the Mediterranean, and I think this is like a very alarming signal that, you know, everything pushing the problems and not taking responsibility, like not sharing the responsibility for what happens outside the borders. Yeah, so that's in a more global or like big picture. And of course, when it comes to Syria, I think there are also very worrying signs that also reflect a larger European problem, I think, that we are seeing a rise of far-right populist, not only discourse, but unfortunately more like concrete actions. Earlier this year, there was a delegation of the far-right German party, AfD, that went to Damascus to assess the situation and whether it's safe enough. And we've seen also Denmark trying to, or not trying actually, already revoking the protection status of 6 Syrian refugees. So I'm really concerned, and I think we should be alerted and watching out for some parties in Norway that often like to follow these trends and be very prepared as well, that as Brahim said, that it might be that the war ends in terms of bombing and shelling, but the persecution does not end, and the majority of Syrians actually are fleeing the persecution, are fleeing the dictatorship and the regime. And if I want to comment just one thing on Norway in particular, I think, and how it fits in the European picture, although I think in terms of numbers, Norway has resettled refugees more than France and the UK, for example, but I don't think this should be a reason to thank Norway, but rather just to indicate how bad the status quo is and how worrying the situation is, as Ruba mentioned. And last point also on Norway and the policies that Norway has been changing towards refugees. I'm also very critical to the fact that it seems that the current government is just trying to make it more and more difficult for refugees to actually feel settled and welcome. One very clear example is the family reunion policy. When I arrived here in 2015, for example, we had to pay almost 5,000 Norwegian kroners. Today, do you know how much is it to pay if you are a refugee here and want to invite your spouse? The number has actually doubled to 10,500 Norwegian kroners. And there's a lot of administrative barriers as well that have been actually introduced last year, with like very limited amount of time you are allowed to invite or like apply for family reunions. So making it more and more difficult for families, especially those who are split across different countries. It's difficult for them to cross and go to the nearest Norwegian embassy to apply. So, but I'm very glad that there are so many active Norwegian civil society groups that are actually advocating for better policies. So it's not a very promising picture. Yeah. Sorry to say that on a policy level.
Yeah, but this is where we are to be challenged.
Yeah.
Well, if we Google space, we get a lot of references to NASA. But then, you know, and I wouldn't. So you're not on the first, you know, top there. But if you Google, you know, scroll down a bit, we get to your space. And can you tell us a bit can you tell us a bit about your work?
Yeah, that's a very good point, and we've been actually having a lot of discussions to revise the name because.
But it's pretty cool. Just keep it.
Yeah, I have to explain the rationale for this name. So SPACE, it stands for Syrian Peace Action Center, but we actually came up with the name first and then tried to break it up into an acronym to make it easier, but then apparently still.
We're all been there, so.
Yeah. Exactly. So yeah, actually, SPACE as a concept has been conceptualized before I even arrived to Norway by the other two co-founding members with me in SPACE. So I feel I need to credit them, and they are Rana Isa, who's a Norwegian Lebanese. She was doing her postdoc at University of Oslo at the time, 2015. Today, she's actually in the protests in Lebanon because she works with the American University of Beirut. And the other member is Murha Faris, who's a Syrian citizen living in Norway. And the concept of SPACE was actually in 2015. We saw that there is a lot of interest in the Syrian debate in Oslo. There's been a lot of events around Syria. However, what was lacking was the Syrians on stage. It was often Syria was often discussed by internationals. So we felt we need to give the platform to Syrians to represent themselves and speak on their own behalf. And the idea of SPACE was actually coming from 2011, going back to the origin of the story when we, the Syrian citizens, or actually we, the Syrian people, felt for the first time that we are citizens when we claimed the public space in 2011. It might be very difficult to explain this to Norwegians, and the more I live in Norway, I realize how surreal the experience is to live under dictatorship. But the way we experienced it in Syria, there was actually no public space that is for the public. It's like very paradoxical given the name. So all our public spaces were actually named after Assad. So the National Library in Syria was the Assad National Library. The Opera House was the Assad Opera House. The big, like Oslo S or Central Station. In Syria, it was like the Jusr Rais. It was like the bridge of the President Assad, where all the buses meet. So we were reminded all the time, of course, with the ubiquitous portray of Assad everywhere, that this is not for us. Of course, it was out of question to even go to the street or demand something or raise a sign. When I was in the university, we wanted just to screen a documentary about the field of study that we were studying, and we had to take the approval of 11 representatives of security branches who sit at the university to screen that documentary that was about Bill Gates. So it wasn't even about anything political. So you can't even think if it was about something related to humanities or human rights. So that was Syria in 2011. And I think 2011 made us for the first time feel that we are citizens. We were individuals before that, or subjects, and then we became citizens when we started discussing what kind of Syria we want to have, what kind of governance system we want to have. We started debating rights, how to ensure that LGBT people have rights, women's rights, It was a moment of great glory, I would think, and pride that we still take today. So fast forward to 2015, we are in Norway. We wanted to revive that space that was once reclaimed by the Syrian people, and we wanted to as well reclaim the narrative, because it was very clear for us in Norway that the debate is kind of only talking about Assad and the jihadists. ISIS was, of course, very dominant in the news, but the Syrian people, again, were almost invisible. So we wanted to reclaim that narrative that is centered around the people and centered around their agency, their everyday acts of resistance, art, and culture, how they're being the most creative and resilient people, even in the most difficult situations. And I'm sure Ruba has so many examples. We tend to think of people living under the bombs or in refugee camps as, poor victims. They are waiting for us to go and help them. But no, they're actually the first ones, the first responders. The most creative artists, the most creative graffiti art actually came out of the most difficult situations in Syria. So this was us in 2015. I want to just end with saying what happened today is, of course, we're seeing a little bit changed in the map. In Syria, reality has changed. We're still, of course, centered around the people, but we also see the need to open up more and talk with, or like engage more actively with the Syrians in Norway. Today, Syrians are the 7th largest minority in Norway, and we are the fastest growing minority. So there's, of course, a lot to engage with, and the same concept of citizenship that we felt in Syria in 2011, we also want to continue to engage with here. So we are expanding our work more now to ensure that not only Syrians, but all newcomers, minorities, immigrants, and majority citizens actually have the tools to engage in the public debate and to influence the public debate. But of course, for us Syrians, there's a lot for us to learn about Norway, democracy, and where to engage and how. So we are trying to focus more on this as well now.
Thank you, Zaina, and thanks for being here with us today, and thanks for enlightening us. You lived here for some time, and I think that getting your perspective on how Norway and Norwegians and Ola Norman is, it's and how we better can understand people living as refugees from Syria. It's important. So thank you a lot, and we'll move on in the program. We can just sit here. It was nice sitting here. So our next speaker is Nusha Kabawat. He is working for the International Center for Transformational Justice. He is the special coordinator for Syria and the founder and director of Project Amal Salam. Kabawat has implemented trainings for Syrian activists in conflict resolution, negotiation, civil society building, and transitional justice. In addition to have worked with children living as refugees to empower them through education, intervention, and trauma-based care. We look very much forward to hear you, Nusha.
Thank you so much. 13. Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here, and Mabruk to my great friend Ruba, and I'm so honored and humbled to also be here among such inspiring Syrians. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to take my time with you today here to discuss a few things that I think are important when talking about Syrian children, the trauma they have encountered as a result of the conflict in Syria, and of course, ways forward. I'd like to start, first of all, by discussing the situation in Syria and the numerous human rights violations that have taken place there, and as we've heard today, continue to take place there. Then I'd like to walk you a little bit through my own journey, setting up my own organization, Project Amal Salam, when I was a young student like many of you, and the work that we have done that has changed the mindset of thousands of Syrian children. Sound good? Everything changed. Those are the words of a young Syrian student from Idlib, currently living in Lebanon, speaking about the aftermath of an attack on his school that took the lives of his brother and friends, and that forever changed his own life. He now works in a tailor's office because he could no longer bear going to school, faced with the memories and trauma of that day. His story is just one among countless others of lives irrevocably changed as a result of attacks on schools, and the loss not only of loved ones, but of childhood, innocence, and mainly opportunity. Worse, it is not just individual lives that have been changed by these attacks. The widespread attacks on schools in Syria during the country's brutal conflict have torn apart families and altered the future of Syrian society. In 2006, I led a project for the International Center for Transitional Justice, along with 10 Syrian partners, that aimed to understand the impact of attacks on schools in Syria, on children, teachers, and the community as a whole. The motivation behind this work was the desire to first, of course, end the violence, and second, ensure that the resulting harms are fully understood so that national and international actors alike are left with no choice but to address them through a nuanced and well-informed process of justice, acknowledgement for victims, redress, and reform. Pulling together all available documentation, the Safe Syrian Schools Project, which is what we called ourselves, counted a total of 1,292 schools that were attacked from 2011 to 2017. These figures are painstakingly documented and also quite modest. The UN Secretary General issued a report at the end of 2014 concluding that 4,072 schools have been closed or damaged or are now being used as shelters. Others estimate that 1 in 3 schools in Syria is currently non-operational because they were destroyed, turned into displacement center, or repurposed for military functions. The cases looked at by our project highlights the grave breaches of obligations applicable under international law for the protection of children and civilians in armed conflict, including those contained in the Convention on the Rights of the Child and its optional protocol on the involvement of children in armed conflict, as well as the Geneva Conventions of 12th of August 1949 and their additional protocols of 1977. The project confirms that the devastation wrought on schools and students by the regime of Bashar al-Assad and other parties to the conflict appears to violate many of the foundational rules of international law. Certain weapons, such as cluster munitions and incendiary bombs, have been used in areas of Syria where schools were located and operating. These weapons are banned by much of the world, whereas others, such as barrel bombs, are considered indiscriminate by nature because of the magnitude of suffering they are likely to inflict. Ultimately, of course, the government of Syria, of Bashar al-Assad, bears primarily responsibility for protecting its population and civilian infrastructure. And because children are amongst the most vulnerable members of society and become more so during conflict, they are accorded both general protections as civilians and special protections as persons who are particularly vulnerable under international law. Syria is a state party to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and under the 2012 Constitution of Syria, is obligated to protect childhood, take care of young children and youth, and provide the suitable conditions for the development and their talents. And yet, the report finds several indicators that suggest clear intentionality of attacks, including use of guided missiles, knowledge of the location of the schools, scouting, monitoring, and surveillance of locations before attacks, serial attacks on the same day on the same school, and repeat attacks on the same school at different points during the conflict. As a result of attacks on schools, hundreds of teachers have been killed, scores have left the country, and many others simply no longer show up for work. Terrified parents refuse to send their children to school for fear of more violence, exacerbating the education gap and expanding this lost generation. What is more, this fear has affected girls in very high numbers, and much higher than boys, and led to increased rates of child marriage as parents desperately seek other options for their children. It is not just parents who are afraid for their children. Students and teachers alike spoke of being traumatized by past attacks and too scared to go back to school after losing limbs or watching their friends die. The intense psychological and emotional trauma experienced by both students and teachers becomes very clear. The reason I'm explaining all this to you is because I believe it's crucial to understand what makes a person leave his country and seek refuge in a country that is not his own, in a country that, in most cases, as we've seen, do not want them there and see them as more of a burden than as human beings. Imagine being a mother and having to stop your child from his most basic right, a right to an education, of being scared to send your child to a space that should be a safe space, a space to learn, to grow, to imagine. Instead, it's a place where you're scared to send them because it could be the last time you see them. Today, in neighboring countries to Syria, local organizations like Sawa for Aid and my own, Project Amal Salam, we've taken on the responsibility of not only providing Syrian children with the education that was robbed from them and that they deserve, but also in finding ways to re-inspire and empower an entire generation of children who have lost hope in the world around them and themselves. I founded Project Amal Salam, meaning Project Hope and Peace, in July 2013. I was pursuing a master's in Washington, D.C. As part of my studies, I traveled to Turkey, and I crossed the border into an internally displaced people's camp inside Syria. I was trying to find a way to serve my people. And in that moment, it really hit me that my people are refugees, living in tents. And the conditions were unbearable. But what really shook me the most was not even those conditions, was I came across a group of young children, and they were chanting these anti-regime slogans and chants. For us as activists, we find them charming and clever. But to see young children who know nothing about conflict and know nothing about war and shouldn't even have to think of these absurd issues really broke my heart. They were also repeating these devastating things that they would hear their parents say as adults who have lost hope and who have had everything taken away from them, like the world has forgotten us and we're nothing. And I looked around me and I took it all in, these barefoot children in these makeshift tents, these parents asking the camp staff for food and food baskets. And like Ruba mentioned, these are people who back home had careers, were lawyers and doctors and teachers and human beings. It was truly an eye-opening moment for me. And then I asked the kids, what grade are you in? And they said they were supposed to be in first grade, but because the camp wasn't able to provide them with books, they were not in school at all. And for me as an Arab, it surprised me because we know that copyright is not really a thing and we can just photocopy these books. But in that moment, in that moment I was, in my head, transported back to my own childhood in Damascus, where I grew up in my family's ancestral home, where I zigzagged through these small streets of the old Damascus, where my biggest fear was cheating on my exam maybe, but not being able to go to school as a result of an attack. Things, as a child, we shouldn't think about. Children should be talking about their hopes, their dreams, their childhoods. So when I went back to DC, I knew what I needed to do. I wanted to build an organization that had a bottom-up approach that would seek to answer the needs that I saw those days. One was to respond to the need of schools for supplies, books, backpacks, transportation for kids, generators. The second was that I would design a program for the children that would change the way they saw the world around them, and also the way they saw themselves. So I designed a program that would incorporate peace building, conflict resolution, hope, and empowerment into a series of workshops that include arts, music, sports, photography. But also, something that Ruba, I think, mentioned was we really wanted to reconnect them to this idea of being proud of being Syrian. Of when you ask them, where are you from? They would say, I'm from Syria, with pride and not with shame. What started off as a small movement of volunteers and a few $1,000s I had raised through friends and family has today turned into a global movement. Over the past 6 years, we've worked with over 8,000 children in Lebanon, Turkey, Jordan, and Syria, and we've recruited over 200 volunteers from all over the world. We've also opened schools and community centers of our own, responding to the needs on the ground. In 2014, we opened a school in a small village in Jordan, where we would help Syrian children catch up on the education they had missed in order to be able to enroll them in the Jordanian system. We have graduated approximately 200 children from that center and enrolled them in the official system. In 2015, as a result of the increase in airstrikes in Aleppo, with the direct Russian military intervention, we built an underground community center to serve as a safe space for children to learn without the fear of an airstrike. That also had to close down as the attacks became too frequent and it became even too dangerous to have them underground. It then became a shelter for our volunteers. To share some good news today, last Sunday we opened a new center in Jordan, and we'll be serving around 100 children, and we're determined to continue sharing with them messages of peace, tolerance, and hope. The importance of education for Syrian refugees is undeniable. From the children I have met and worked with at Ruba schools to my own, the one thing that is cross-cutting is their unwavering desire to learn. Their curiosity when I'm teaching them yoga, their joy when they get a math equation correctly, and their strength when we ask them what we will do if we go back to Syria, and they all yell, rebuild it. I believe that today the only thing that can guarantee a sustainable peace in Syria is educating the young generation of Syria that will one day go back, rebuild it, inhabit it, and allow it to strive. We must empower these children to believe that they are important, that they are capable, and that they are not simply a lost generation. We must instill in these children the importance of unity and of tolerance. We must deal with the endless trauma that they have endured And we must also teach them that the only way forward is not revenge, but forgiveness. We must do everything in our power to simply give back these children their childhood as to guarantee they will not become ill-prepared, angry adults. What all this means is that educating Syrian refugees and empowering them requires today much more than just a curriculum. More than just math and Arabic and English, it requires innovation, creativity, and patience in order to be able to bring back the Syrian children what they have lost, which is not only going to school, but also all the things that come with that. Requires a lot of outside-of-the-box thinking, and organizations like SEWA are truly doing that. Please continue to support grassroots organizations, donate, volunteer, ask us how you can do that. And like Ibrahim said, the work is long and is difficult, but no, we will not give up. And for me, the hope of a future Syria are the children of Syria. Thank you.
Reclaiming their childhood in order to become adults. Thank you, Nosha. Before we move on to the panel discussion, we'll have a musical performance by Amalie Holt-Kleive. Amalie is an artist from Bergen who makes electronic and touching music. Kleive is an artist with love for performance. He is versatile and masters several instruments. Additionally, Kleive has a bachelor's in jazz vocal from Grieg Akademia here in Bergen, and has played classic piano for over 10 years. Amalie.
Thank you. I want to play a song that my mother has written, and it is in Norwegian. It's called Salme I. Når lyset ikke varmer mer, når mørket ikke skremmer, når du lar lyset brenne ned og hører rare stemmer. Alt så rolig uten vind, selv løvet holder pusten. Da vekkes toner fra en annen tid og rister av seg rusten. En sliten sjel med blåsvart sinn ber om nåde denne natten. Og mørket vender det annet kinn til og tar ydmykt av seg hatten. Hva var det livet kunne
Many thanks. That was beautiful. Now we'll move over to the panel session, and I'll ask Musha, Ibrahim, Zaina to join me on stage.
Hi again.
Hi. Welcome.
It's been a while.
How does it feel? Are we comfortable?
Yes.
Yes. Are we ready for the people's vote?
We love the people's vote.
Yes. We are obliged to.
That word means something completely different in the UK. When you say the people's, just saying, it's not acceptable.
So yes, okay. Let's see. What is this? Oh, here we. This is how it's going. Yes, and we also have technology that makes us able to see it here. Yeah. What comes after the Syrian war? Let's just say that we'll start with the question you voted for here, but you can continue to vote throughout the session. So this can be quite. So if you want us to take another question afterwards, keep on pushing your cell phones. So, but to this question here, what comes after the Syrian war? What can happen with the people living as refugees, and how can the world community secure their rights? It's a very focused question. How would anyone like to give it a try?
Maybe I could just begin with a reflection from Norway, because the UN special envoy to Syria now is Norwegian, and I'm very afraid because there's a tendency sometimes in the Norwegian media to make like superheroes of like Norwegian diplomats, and in the recent breakthrough, or they called it breakthrough, and they actually, one of the newspapers I read, they called him the super diplomat, Geir Pedersen. After they started up this constitution committee, or declared that there is now a constitution committee working on a new constitution for Syria. So this is something that is absolutely not bringing any peace or hope, I think, for many Syrians, because it has never been, the constitution has never been the issue for Syria. So I'm just like, I'm very anxious that sometimes with these like big headlines and news, especially that the military operations might have come to an end soon, that we might hear, there is a breakthrough happening, that the opposition and the regime are sitting together in Geneva, signing documents. But as long as this peace does not guarantee the rights for all Syrians, and as long as the regime is still in power, which is the main barrier why many Syrians are not coming back, then I'm afraid this would not be peace. It might be stability, but it might not be the peace that we are looking for.
Michelle?
I don't disagree with Zaina, but I also think the Constitution is an opportunity to negotiate certain levels of justice for victims if negotiated correctly. I know we see it as maybe an act or something that is manipulated by the different governments who are involved in the process, and I agree with that. But I also think that we've reached a level in the 8 years of conflict where we do need to seek those different innovative ways of reaching some sort of the maximum level of justice that we can get for victims. And in a lot of cases around the world, actually the Constitution has been one of the ways to guarantee some levels of justice. And I think if negotiated correctly, and if we include some measures for transitional justice, then it could be possible. So I'm not unhopeful, but we take everything with a grain of salt in Syria now, because things changed overnight.
Ibrahim, what comes after the war?
I'm terrified what comes after the war, but not what happens with Syria, but what happens in the next war, wherever it might be. Because if we allowed the kind of crimes to continue that happened in Syria and go with impunity for perpetrators, Syria is a nice country somewhere in the Middle East, and it's beautiful and all of that. But when Russia, particularly, or the regime, they break international laws, they're not sending a message to Syrians. Syrians have never heard of internationals, a lot under the kind of local education. But they're sending a message to Norway, to the UK, to the US, that I can break the Geneva Conventions, that you are party to, and I can get away with it without you doing anything about it. So what comes after the Syrian war, if justice is not served, and if people are not held accountable, then God forbid how the next war would look like. But in terms of what will happen with Syria, I'm very happy that I don't gamble because honestly, almost every bet I would have put down of what will happen in Syria would probably went completely the opposite way. I think it's impossible to predict. It's impossible to predict what would happen. In Syria, there are too many variables, too many realities, too many scenarios. But what we would like to happen is a different story, and I think what we would like to happen should influence what could happen in Syria. I think asking a question like that, we're not talking about the past. We're talking about something that is currently happening, and so what comes after the Syrian war is really determined by what we do today, what states do today, what concerned citizens such as yourself do today. And before I hand back over to you, I think I want to pick up on two things that I'm sure are done by Rafto on purpose. One, that you exercised your right to vote today, which is something Syrians would have been terrified of. And so don't take it for granted, because at least 150 of you have. This voting turnout is not acceptable.
True.
And this shows how much we need to be active within our domestic politics, how much we have a say in order to put the politicians, and hold them to account in order to be able to say what will happen for the Syrian war.
Yeah. And in terms of how can a world community secure the rights of the people living as refugees?
Give them the choice. What can happen with people living as refugees is for them to decide. It's not for us to decide. Those of them who want to come back should be allowed to do so. Those of them who want to stay and contribute, respecting local cultures and respecting local laws, should be allowed to do so. I don't believe that there's something called the world community, personally. I mean, I work in international law, but and so it's a bit skeptic there. But I think every state should do what it can to give refugees a genuine choice, not the choice that you've highlighted Lebanon is giving to refugees.
So if we, and by the way, it's possible to increase the voter turnout as we go along here. So that's an encouragement from Ibrahim here. So if we go to let's see on the poll here, we're sort of moving into that, and on what kind of change is required by the world community in terms of, when we look at how the world community or policymakers or just citizens of different nations, how we deal with the rights of refugees, what can be done?
I think I could just reflect back or connected to the first question, and I think it's I think Ibrahim said enough already about asking the refugees and giving them the choice. But I think when it comes to Syria in particular, again, we have to be very conscious to the idea of, as long as we don't have justice, and as long as, so I agree with both speakers, as long as justice is not served for the victims and the survivors and their families, then there will not be any peace in Syria. And on the EU or the international community, I mean, it's a big recommendation. I don't know how much they will be able to take this, or if they're listening anyway, but they're like this short-sighted politics of always supporting and favoring stability over human rights and over justice. I think it's very alarming. It's very dangerous, not only for the region, but as Ibrahim said, for the world, like supporting Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, Sisi in Egypt, all different, dictators in the region, because they are afraid to face the consequences right now, but they're just like pushing these consequences maybe for 4 or 5 years later until I don't know, a new cycle of violence, of unrest erupts. So this security over human rights, I think, is a very dangerous policy that unfortunately we are bearing the brunt of in Syria and in the Middle East.
Nusha, any comment?
Not really. I mean, I think they both said it, but I think I'm looking at this, what kind of change is required by the world community. I don't know.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think Ibrahim said it very well, and I think that it's very alarming. And I think also for us and everyone in this room as human rights defenders and activists, I think something we probably all go through is waking up in the morning and saying, what is this movement I'm a part of, or what is this field I'm working tirelessly to promote, or when you talk about breaching all these international laws and nobody holding anybody responsible, it's really alarming. And I think it's alarming also that as victims of conflicts today, maybe the thing that, even in Syria, from my own work I've seen is people care more, victims are looking more towards acknowledgement of their pain and their suffering, and rather than criminal prosecution, in my opinion, is because also they've given up a lot of hope in the international community and their ability to hold people to those standards. And as the international community, I think that's something really disappointing, and I think it's something we need to think about where we are in the world today.
I'd like to pick up on what Nosha has said about this idea of acknowledgement. And just to pick up a practical point of what kind of change is required. And I think in one way, the world has changed in the way we're dealing with information, right? So I think in the context of Syria, we're not dealing with a situation where the perpetrators are trying to hide their crimes. They're overflowing the system. They're injecting fake news into it. And I think this is something that we can do. This is something that we can work on. Not seeing Syria as one line, as just a conflict or a war, being able to look beyond that. I think disinformation campaigns, and again, it is not a Syrian phenomena. It is something that we've seen with Trump, it's something that we've seen with Brexit, it's something that we've seen with a lot of groups paying, Facebook now is under investigation over and over again, for political advertisement. There's a lot of that. And a lot of these tools, the bots, the social media accounts, all of that are being used in the Syrian context in order to be able to disinform, take away the narrative from the victims so that, when you're asked about Syria, instead of knowing what's happening, you'll say, it's too complicated, it's too confused. You start doubting legitimate groups that are doing excellent humanitarian work. Every time, I used to personally go to the comment section on every video to see the people's views or, hear of how people are holding them to account. They're no longer the place to go because the amount of bots and likes and counter likes and all this technology that's being put into it, you're actually seeing a state view projected in the voice of community or the fake community. So the change that we need to have on the world community and the citizens, and this is something that all of you control with a click with your phone, is to be able to adapt to this change, change in data and information and disinformation and knowledge management in order not to let perpetrators get away with their crimes.
Thanks.
And I managed to get 20 extra people to vote. So.
We're watching it here. That's great.
I should run for.
So let's see here. What's up on? So if we have, what are the biggest challenges for people living as refugees? How can you solve them? Wisha, you've been talking a bit about this already.
Yeah, and I think everybody's been talking about it today. I think it's, education, but I think also having the communities that they're part of see them as willing and capable members of society. I think it's one thing to put refugees in a camp and educate them and give them access to health, and it's another to empower them. And I think that this is a really important need that is a lot of time neglected because, we see the first as the basic needs, which is give them water, which they're not getting, give them education, which they're also not getting, and all these things. But actually empowering refugees, and as we've seen all over the world, and as I'm sure you've seen through your work, refugees all over the world have given back so much to the societies and communities that they tend to join. So I think one of the needs that we see is refugees being inspired, as being empowered, as and being able to give back. And I think if we started seeing the issue in that way, then a lot of the host communities would have a different type of situation. Rather than seeing them as a burden, they could actually be really capable and giving members of that society.
I think, I don't know how much I can talk about challenges, and especially that my experience is more in Norway, but to maybe actually reflect on that, I think, speaking of refugees in Norway and how the system takes in refugees, I think there is so much reform that can actually happen in enabling people to be more able to use their own capacities, their own skills that they come with already. I know very few, very few Syrians, again, speaking on the Syrian experience, but I know it's there's so many refugees from other nationalities, but because this is my experience, I know very few Syrians who were actually able to put their previous education and careers into practice in Norway. And I think this is a big question mark for the system. And we're talking about one of the richest countries in the world that was not able to be a little bit more flexible to incorporate carpenters, electricians, painters, lawyers, teachers into the workforce in the sense that would allow them to be, perform at their best capacity, because this is what they know best at. Many of them, of course, I'm not against, of course we should be required to maybe take extra education and language and all of that, but it's actually many people's careers are put into zero once they come to Norway and they have to start over. So I think, that's a big question. I mean, it's a big question, we're not going into it now, but again, seeing people, seeing their histories and not disconnecting them from what they have actually had been doing for so many years before they come to this new society.
In the morning here, I talked about how after the Second World War, the UN system was established, the international institutions, the UN Human Rights Declaration, the Refugee Convention. And there's one question here that's also got quite a bit of votes, is why don't the UN and international organizations do more?
Because they're state-centric.
Yes, exactly.
The UN is made up of states. People forget that.
Yes.
There is the executive arm, which is very good at issuing reports and raising alarms and saying this area is besieged. But then the states deliver aid until the UN deliver aid in a different area. If we're dealing with an organization that is state-centric, and then we're dealing with a proxy war like Syria where the states are not agreeing, then they are rendered useless. The political arms are rendered useless. We can keep using the executive arms, the coordination for humanitarian aid, the refugees agency to collect data, to give us the reports, credible reports that we can then, like the Commission of Inquiry, that we can then raise with the political arms in the Human Rights Council, Security Council, General Assembly, and the rest of it. But I think states, and partly our fault, have been able to hide behind international organizations. The UN is unable to do something. Great, you're a member of the UN.
Exactly.
You're supposed to be able to do something. And I think, and I tell that to UK politicians all the time, you're hiding behind the Russian veto. It makes your life easy if Russia vetoes, because that would mean you would not be able, you would not actually have to do something about it. And so most states are part of the UN. Most states have voting, almost all states have voting powers, whether in the General Assembly or the Security Council and all of that. And this is where each and every state and each and every citizen of the state need to make their states accountable within the international organization for them to work. And not to hold on to international organizations when they don't work, right? And to be honest, the UN, in a large extent, has failed in Syria. This is not something that is, scandalous to say anymore. So reform and more involvement from states, not hiding behind, this cover of international organizations.
Yeah. No, I think Ibrahim said it all. I think we forget that the UN is made up of member states, and so I've been in rooms where, we're attacking the UN, and then the UN people are like, but we're made up of member states. So everybody bears responsibility, but there's a cycle here, and I think we need to figure out how to break it. And I think that's the main issue.
Yeah, I think building up on that, just also connecting it back to the Norwegian context, Norway is one of the largest donors to, especially the Syria response, the fourth largest donor, I think. And there's so much to actually be done pressuring Norway, or not pressuring, but advocating for Norway to make sure that they're upholding as well the international law when it comes to humanitarian aid. I don't know if you remember a few years back, there was a scandal that Norwegian taxpayer money is going to a hospital that was run by ISIS or something like that. And there was a lot of like follow-up actions after that. But today, I don't think many actually are following as well how the humanitarian aid could and is being manipulated by the Syrian regime, and how Norwegian taxpayer money could also be used to finance those who have been committing war crimes before. I'm not going so much into details. I know Brahim has done like extensive research on that and all the entities that are actually working closely with the UN, because UN works a lot through partners. And of course, if you're working in government areas in Syria, you have to have a link somehow to the ruling family in order to be able to function. So I think also increasing our awareness that often it's also portrayed in Norway that the money that's going to the UN is like outsourced. The risk is outsourced. We don't do a lot of checking. We don't kind of checking after the UN, because they have a very rigid system in place. And yes, they have a very rigid bureaucracy. But again, if the political will is not there, we need to as well check what the UN is doing and hold them accountable. So it's actually our money that we are paying to the UN that we could follow up on and ensure it's living up to the international law.
I think, Maya, you gave us some understanding of the living conditions for people living as refugees in Lebanon. What can be done to improve those living conditions?
I think Maya or Ruba would be better suited to answer this, but I mean, honestly, I think that there's so much to be done when it comes to Lebanon, and I think that international organizations do not have a lot of times the access that smaller grassroots organizations like Sawa for Aid do have, and also the community presence and delivering projects and aid in a way that is sustainable, dignified, and respectful for those communities. I think one of the ways to improve those conditions is to increase support to those types of organizations who are not just giving food baskets, who are not just filling their quotas and making sure that a certain percentage of kids are in school, but making sure that the way that that is happening is done in a very respectful and sustainable way. Because I think one of the main issues you see in Lebanon is funding issues, for sure. Also access, because the government does not take responsibility for these camps and whatnot. But I think that also smaller grassroots organizations get certain levels of funding, but then that are cut off when the focus shifts or priorities shift. And I think that creates these bumps along the way. So I think having a steady stream of funding to the right people in the right places would really help increase and improve the living conditions of Syrian refugees.
In Norway and many other European countries, when this is, when migration, refugees are discussed, it's often a discussion of politicians saying, if you don't want that much migration, you say that we're going to help them where they are. How is that working?
Well, I think the first point is that refugees are being used as a commodity, exactly. As a card, as a bargaining chip. I give Lebanon and a lot of regional countries, including Turkey. They're holding Europe to ransom. In the sense, I will open the floodgates, I'll send people across the sea, I'll send people back. Lebanon, on the other hand, for example, is working with this Russian deal in order to get European reconstruction funding that, look, Syrians are returning, so give us the money in order to reconstruct Syria so people can stay. Myth, a lie. That's not how it works. In a lot of cases, people say, let's give them if it was an economic issue, I would understand that. But at least in the situation inside Syria. But if it's a right-based issues and you have a corrupt financial domestic system, you're financing the reasons why these human rights abuses are taking place in the first place. And so yes, while it's important to give neighboring countries the support they need in order to be able to, give them a living condition that, works. It's important to not be affected, not to be held, at ransom. It's important not to, allow them to manipulate the facts, the numbers, to be able to say, no, I will need 10 times this number, and to make sure that the money is actually going to the people that kind of, need it and not used by corrupt politicians. And when you think of it, and that's something that money cannot do, what Maya was talking about, legal status is a human right. It's the same thing like the right to food and right to water. You cannot access hospital, education, get your food items without being registered and have some paperwork. And that's something Norwegian money cannot buy in Lebanon. It can probably have influence on Lebanon, which it should use. But then again, if people leave these countries because they're technically invisible, then they should not be blamed for leaving. And taking into account, and it was so hilarious when we've seen these reports when the migration crisis had. And one reporter said, "I found a refugee with an iPhone." Of course, you'll find a refugee with an iPhone because we're not fleeing. Most of us are not fleeing an economic situation that can be solved with money. It's persecution and war and human rights. And if your money can buy that, great. But I'm not sure it can.
Thank you. We are moving towards the end of this panel discussion, but I just wanted to add a question which is not on the poll, and that relates to what's happening in Lebanon just now. We've seen, 1/5, 1/4 of the population out in the streets demonstrating. We've seen, the government now saying that they will resign. Do you have any idea what will happen from here? How will this also impact people from Syria living in Lebanon?
I think it's a very important question, and I think it's something we discuss amongst ourselves and with our Lebanese friends, and then a lot of times me as somebody I call myself the daughter of the Syrian revolution, of course I stand with the Lebanese revolution, and sometimes people will tell me, but it's not your fight. And I think that we've seen very clearly that it is our fight, and that we need to stop thinking about, especially our region, as these borders and what happens there doesn't affect us, because as we've clearly seen, what happened in Syria is affecting what is happening in Lebanon. And what is happening in Lebanon will clearly affect what is happening, one, in Syria, of course, because if Hezbollah loses some power, that will also be a big, let's hope. But also, with so many Syrian refugees living in Lebanon, it's undoubted that if the conditions of Lebanese everyday daily lives improve, then that will definitely improve the lives of Syrian people. Also, I think we think of Lebanese and Lebanon as having been very unwelcoming to Syrians over the past few years. And I always say that, of course, I hate it, but also I don't want us to forget that there is a long history between Syria and Lebanon. And also, I don't think anybody is born a racist. I think that's a product of your environment, of the system you come from, of the politics around you. And I think that if in these moments we're able to break these boundaries and for us to be unified and stand together, I think that's a very important step for Syrians and Lebanese as communities.
And if I can pick up on that, what I found inspiring from the videos and the chants that I've seen is that there are a lot of people that recognize that their economic situation is not as a result of refugees. It's a result of corrupt politicians who steal the country, including money that was supposed to go to refugees. And when we're seeing chants saying, refugees are welcome in such an uprising where the government has tried to blame refugees for every single failure of their own, that's a message of hope. That is a message, that the people are waking up and recognizing, that Syrians are not the kind of community that would burden the economy. They're there because a lot of those who are in Lebanon cannot return because Hezbollah, a political power in Lebanon, is occupying their houses in Syria. So they technically cannot return. Hezbollah is militarily active in west and the southwest of Syria. So I think that there is a lot that could happen out of it. And just to pick up on what Nosha said, it's a very fine line between saying, state sovereignty and the people choose. But then once the people make a choice, then it's our choice whether to side by them or not. We suffered this in Syria where people said, this is an internal affair. Great, internal affair. Listen to what the internal people want, and then take a side that is not with the perpetrator, but with the victims and those who want to stand up for their rights. So I do not think, that Lebanon can be seen in abstract from Syria or Turkey or Iraq or Palestine or any other country in the Middle East. And as we've seen, what happened in one country, in Syria, affected almost every country in the world with this whole refugee crisis. So this is an opportunity for all of us to get involved, knowing our stuff, getting, managing the knowledge that we're getting, and getting in line in solidarity behind people that are calling for their rights.
Ibrahim.
Why do you keep clapping for him?
I don't know.
Ibrahim, Nusha, Zaina, thank you very much for sharing, and thank you.
One more thing? Thank you.
Then we've come to the end of the Rafto Conference 2019. Before we end, I would like to ask Ruba to join me on stage one final time.
So,
how does it feel?
Thanks, everyone. I hope you're not too tired by the end of these very intense 2 hours. I was very humbled and inspired to be here. Maya, thank you so much for your important academic work. You are one of the welcome white people in our societies because you do your work with such a dignifying way to the people. So thank you very much. Thank you, Nusha, for touching us. I've seen Nusha in all positions, don't get me wrong, but she comes and teaches yoga in our schools and does all sorts of activities with the kids. So thank you so much for the work that you do. Thanks, Ibrahim, for debunking these myths about Syria. And thank you, Zaina, for maybe creating a link with the Norwegian audience and the Syrian, constituencies. Manar and Amali, thank you so much. It was such a refreshing segments between all the sadness and tense political discussions to zone out and remember that music is hope and there's always hope and beauty in this life. I think we also discovered, other than Amali and Manar, we discovered new talents. I think Jorgen is not only a director, he's an excellent MC. No? We've discovered that if you need new morning televisions, there's always Zaina that you can invite. Late night shows, we give it to Brahim. But mostly we discovered that that everyone in this room can be an active citizen through voting and being part of the process, being an active agent. But I mostly want to really thank the Rafto speakers, the Rafto Foundation, for planning all of this. It's been a whole year of planning, actually, believe it or not, and especially Liv, because I didn't expect that the same week I was getting married, the price was announced. So in between choosing, fitting dresses and all of that, I was also speaking to Liv daily more than I was speaking to my actual husband. So thank you for all your patience and for also being very open and participatory about this conference. I'm so happy that They've accepted some of my suggestions to have a lot of Syrian speakers because I believe that you should talk with us, not only about us, and we should always be present and speak for our own causes. So thank you for that. Some of the highlights, I think so many beautiful things being said. Speaking about safe, dignified, voluntary return, I would like to add also the sustainable return. We want people to go back and stay. Today we are seeing people go back and then fleeing again illegally. So we spoke about peace. Let's look for sustainable peace. We don't want any more of these quick band-aids that will not be sustainable solutions. Unpacking what refugee is, as Zena was saying, different histories, different presence of these refugees. Everyone has their own story, and every story is worth listening to. The same way every story that you have is worth listening to. And here as Sawa, we don't think that, we don't use the word beneficiary, we use the word community, but we believe that we have two communities we target through our work. The refugees who are in the camps, but everyone else also, because we need to do a bigger paradigm shift in people's minds to be able to affect real change. You don't want more refugees, that's fair enough, so let's all work to end the wars. This is how no new refugees are being made. I also want to talk about the space, not the NASA space and not the Norwegian organization, but the space that is shrinking and shrinking for human rights defenders. Today, it's very difficult to be a human rights defender in Syria. It's even more difficult to be a human rights defender in Lebanon, in the region, and also globally. Human rights defenders are being targeted everywhere. We are constantly having to compromise our values. If you're a Syrian human rights defender living in Turkey, you cannot speak against what Turkey is doing in northwest Syria. If you're a human rights defender, a Syrian human rights defender living in Lebanon, you cannot speak up against what Hezbollah is doing in Syria. If you're a human rights defender in Syria, you cannot speak. So it is the truth. So the space is shrinking, and I want to thank the Rafto Foundation for recognizing that human rights defenders deserve to be acknowledged and supported. I will be finishing up just two quick things. I remember when I was living in London and going back and forth between very difficult realities of being in the camps, people dying from cold, and then the next day having to go to a reception where Syria was discussed over champagne and caviar, and trying to live between these two absurdities of I'm very privileged and speak English, so I have to go speak, but I have to be on the ground. And I remember I was on the train, and they have in London these newspapers that they put all the scandals and who slept with who and who killed who, like this kind of metro newspapers. And there was a genocide happening that day in Syria. And I saw a woman sitting next to me. She was reading every article, who stabbed who, and I don't know what, and all of these little, anecdotes. And then she opened the page on the genocide, and she skipped it in less than a second. She flipped the page, and she didn't read it. And I know that Londoners love their bubble, and you cannot really talk to them in public spaces, but I couldn't, hold myself. So I told her, sorry, can I just ask you why you didn't read these two pages? I'm just curious. And she told me, well, it's complicated. Unfortunately, this is what is made, they make us think. But I believe that human rights and values are not complicated. It's as clear as black and white. So this is something we should always remember. One last word is, when I was asked to receive this award, I had a dilemma. And I said, I don't want to take this award because I'm not doing this for the award. And I don't want, I shouldn't take the award because so many others deserve this. Especially women, we tend to, feel this. I think if a man was given an award, they would say, I deserve it, perfect. But as women, we always, question ourselves a lot. Don't be angry, man. No, but in general, women tend to question ourselves a lot on these issues, and especially people who are really not doing it for that. But I decided, to use this opportunity to further the cause. And I'm very happy that Syria is on the map today here in Bergen, and it's also on the world map. And whoever is attending the award tomorrow, I'll be announcing how I will be using this award to empower more women, because I was so proud to see Nusha, Ibrahim, Zaina, and all of these amazing Syrians sitting here. But for 1 second, it dawned on me that in 10 years' time, if you want to do a panel like this, there will be no Syrians sitting here, because the majority will be without any education, without any job. So I think as human rights defenders, we should also think of ways of how to widen this circle, widen the space that is shrinking, but also looking at how we can support others, use our position of privilege and power to bring people, invite more people in. It's a very abundant world. Resources are everywhere. There's always win-win situations in being proud of what others are doing and inviting them to do more. So thank you for having me here, and thank you for all of you for participating, and I hope to see you in the coming few days. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ruba, for being here and for, I think, touching our hearts here. I think yesterday we at the mayor's dinner, you had actually picked up that Bergen once was the capital of Norway, and you asked everybody, so why isn't it still the capital? So you have noticed that we have some sectarian issues here as well. But seriously, I think that we are really grateful that you have chosen to come here to accept this prize. We believe it's very well deserved. I would like to thank all of you for being here today. And as Ruba and as Ibrahim and others have said, by being here, that's also a contribution. And I invite all of you to come to the prize ceremony tomorrow and the torchlight parade. If you can't be at the prize ceremony, we have the torchlight parade at 8 outside the outside the theater here in Bergen. So thanks to all of you, thanks to our speakers, thanks to everyone and the students who've organized this. And I would like to get all our speakers and musicians up here on stage to get a small gift from Rafto, and just give them a hand. Yeah.